Hello everybody, Miss McKeever here, and today we're going to talk about the rise of the Sun King, and then his eventual reign and all that fun stuff. Alright, so this story begins back with Daddy Sun King. So a guy by the name of Louis XIII, he is the son of Henry IV of Navarre. Remember the guy who ends up getting killed because he tries to promote religious tolerance in France, and the French people have nothing to do with that? Yeah. Well, he's going to become the next king of France, but unfortunately for France, he doesn't really have any interest in ruling. He would be what we call today a big old man child, and would prefer playing with toys as opposed to being an actual king. So instead, his minister, the man who was supposed to help him run, provide advice, do those kind of things, help him rule, is going to actually end up doing pretty much all the ruling himself. And his name is Cardinal Richelieu. And if you remember, Cardinal Richelieu's name popped up when we talked about the 30 Years' War, because that's kind of just what Cardinal Richelieu does. So, Richelieu's going to have three real goals during his time as advisor slash fake king to the real king, because the real king is playing with toys. And his three goals are going to be really built around the idea of being increasing Bourbon, the French dynasty's authority in Europe. So first, his goal is going to be to diminish the standing of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, in the country. And he's going to do that by actually forbidding them from building any cities, fortified cities in the country. They couldn't put walls around their cities. And the idea behind this was that the Protestants then couldn't plot to overthrow the monarchy if they had nowhere to hide. Army could just walk into their cities, destroy the city, and that would be the end of the story. So, weaken the Huguenots. Second, weaken the nobility. He's going to do this in much the same way that he kind of went after the Protestants, in that he's going to ask them to destroy the fortified castles that they had been living in and actually encourage them to build large palaces. The fortified castles would serve as somewhere for people to hide, again, to plot, potentially to overthrow the monarchy. He's going to get them to get rid of those and go for the more open, lavish palaces, which they can't hide in. And then he's also going to use civil servants, people who are hired to help the government run the day-to-day operations of the government, as opposed to relying on nobles to do that for him. And then lastly, he's also going to attempt to weaken the greatest rival to the Bourbon dynasty in Europe, and that's the Habsburgs, by getting France involved in the 30 Years' War in hopes of weakening the Habsburg dynasties. But we already talked about that in the last lesson. We're not really going to spend a lot of time on that this time around. Alright, so this is his goal. His goal is to strengthen France, strengthen the dynasty, and he accomplishes a lot of that stuff. He is going to dramatically weaken political rights for Huguenots in France. They still get to practice their faith, but they don't really have much influence in politics anymore. He's going to exclude nobility from councils that help run the government itself, much like the eventual Louis XIV will do as well. He will also create a network of spies, which is kind of interesting. He's creating a network of information around the country in order to keep an eye on people he views as kind of a threat to the monarchy. It's not very official policy kind of decision here. It's kind of just like back alley deals in order to get as much information as possible. He's going to increase the taille. If you remember in France, that's a kind of a tax that exists on property in France during the time period. But unfortunately, he's also going to incur a lot of debt. And this whole debt thing is going to be a problem throughout the next 100 years of French history. It does not get better. But all of this is designed, all of this is orchestrated around the notion of preparing France for the coming of the next monarch. At a very young age, Richelieu realized that Louis XIV, a small infant child, was going to be a good ruler, especially in comparison to his father, who was an imbecile and didn't do anything. So he's really working in order to prepare this child to become the next ruler of France, to really ascend to the premier throne in Europe. And when he starts getting older, when Richelieu starts getting older, he starts to realize that this is going to be a goal that's going to need to be attained well after he is gone. So he's going to start training himself a a predecessor or a successor, a man who's going to help run France while young Louis is still growing up. And this person he chooses is a guy by the name of Cardinal Mazarin, another Catholic cardinal in France during this period. He's going to see him as the next heir apparent to the regency, the person who's going to help run the country for Louis. And this is going to pave the way for Louis. Mazarin is going to step into the role of Richelieu upon his death and really try to keep France together while young Louis XIV grows up. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the same amount of tact that Richelieu had. He's not as good as walking to the line of like how far you can push the nobles before they react badly and yet not cross that line. Mazarin, unfortunately, will cross that line a couple times, and eventually it leads to a bit of an uprising. Back when Louis is a small child still, he's roughly 4 years old, the nobles are going to try to coordinate with the peasantry of France a rebellion against the monarchy and against Mazarin. Now, officially, this is only a rebellion against Mazarin, only a rebellion against the minister in charge. It's not supposed to be an attack on Louis, but everyone knows that this is supposed to be an attack on the monarchy itself and on Louis. And little Louis, at the age of 4, will remember this for the rest of his life and will embed in him a distinct hatred of two things. One, the nobility in France. He will never trust them. And two, he'll also develop a bit of a hatred of the city, of Paris, of the masses, the peasants, because he feels like they're just chaos. You can't control them. So these two things, these two distrusts, these two hatreds will really help mold Louis throughout the rest of his life. So, Louis grows up. Eventually, the Fronde, this riot, ends because it fails. The nobles don't trust each other. They don't organize well enough. The peasants don't really trust the nobility. There's a lot of issues as to why it fails, but it will fail. And at the end of the day, Louis will escape and he will become the new king of France. And at 23 years old, he becomes an immediate star in the scene. He's going to do something that no French monarch has done for quite a long time, and that is that he's going to rule without a minister to help him rule. He is going to take a very, very forward approach to ruling. He doesn't want someone ruling for him. He doesn't want to split control. All power has to reside around him. And he does this for two reasons. One, he doesn't want a conflict of opinion in his court. He wants him to have the only voice of what happens in France. And two, he doesn't want anything like the Fronde happening again, where the people can say they are rebelling against a minister and not against the monarchy. If they are rebelling against the monarchy, he can act in full weight of the military in order to protect the throne. Whereas if he's attacked, or the minister is kind of attacked, or it's an attack on that, it becomes this wishy-washy gray area where he wants any attack on the government to be a direct attack on him. He doesn't want people hiding behind supposed enemies or people who are trying to do stuff against Louis, but at the same time they're doing it against someone else, and it's supposed to be weird. And no, he wants everything to be black and white. You're either with me or against me. And it's kind of it's a ballsy move during this period for someone to make this kind of a statement very early on in his rule. Again, he's only 23 years old when he does this. So, upon becoming king, upon making this great statement, he's going to try to reorganize the government of France, and in many ways do this in order to limit the ability of nobles, the high nobles, from having influence in France. So first up, he's going to create leadership councils. These councils are going to help him run the government. They're advisors, kind of like what a minister would do, but not really giving one person control. But these people provide him information. This is how I best would approach this. This is how I would try to do this. But he's also doing this exclusively with what we would call the lower nobility. People who are not extraordinarily wealthy, who are not part of very old families who have been controlling France, people who could be seen as rivals. He's cutting all of those people out of the government, and he's choosing people who are directly tied to him. Maybe he granted these families their noble status. Maybe these nobles have direct ties to his father or his grandfather, but they're people he generally trusts for advice. And then next, he's also going to create what he calls regional parliaments. And these regional parliaments are going to be small groups, again, of nobles in each various portion of France. And they're just going to feed to him the information. What is going on in Marseille? What is going on in Lourdes? What's going on in the various small towns or chunks of France where the peasants live? Where life might be different there than what it might be in Paris. Or life might be different in southern France than what it is in northern France. So he's trying to gather as much information as possible. Again, not using the high nobles, using people who are tied to him. So this is a pretty significant chunk for him. His goal is pretty early on. It's pretty clear to anyone who's looking that his goal is to weaken the power of the nobles. He's going to exclude them from council. He's going to create an entire intendant system, a group of civil servants that he hires, educated Frenchmen, to carry out the government, to replace the nobles and the government in their entirety. And he's going to work in trying to subvert those ties that the nobles have to their people by regularly being there himself. He is doing something that most people during this time period didn't do. And he's being an active leader in his country. He's not just sitting on a throne in a palace somewhere and pretending like he exists in one world and the rest of France exists in another one. He wants all the control all the time. He wants the power. He is the Sun King. And he is awesome. So what does this mean when you call him the Sun King? And he will get this name very early on. The idea for him was that the world revolved around him. Much like the planets revolve around the sun, Europe revolves around me. And he needed a showcase to really exemplify what this is and where it's coming from. So he is going to build the greatest palace of all palaces, the palace at Versailles. It is a palace that is supposed to show Europe how dominant France is, how they are the quintessential power in Europe. Show his love of art. It is going to be this great repository of art in Europe. And also cripple the nobility in probably the most clever way possible. Because during this period, France will be the dominant power in Europe. And Louis wants everyone to see it. So what he does is he builds this palace, as you see here. And then he actually places a formal invitation to the great noble families of France and says, you know what, look at this place. This gorgeous palace that I built. 20 miles outside of Paris. Because again, does not trust Paris, does not trust the mobs. So he builds it away from the city and says, come live with me. And if you come live with me, you'll be with me at all times. You can become involved in the government again. And look at this gorgeous place you're going to live in. You have everything. You can hunt here, you can live here, you can enjoy the greatest foods of all time, the greatest music in all of Europe. Everything is here, and you get to be a part of it with me. But this gave him an opportunity to now observe and watch over everyone. He now had a direct way to observe and keep an eye on the people he trusted least. It was extraordinarily clever. Phenomenal move. Great tactical advantage for him. And the people came. And it was successful. But it's also stupid expensive. And this is the problem. Louis realizes relatively early on that he needs to find some way to pay for all of his expenditures, particularly at Versailles and also on the battlefield. So he'll commission and hire a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who will become France's financial minister. And early on, through the use of colonies and mercantilism, particularly the trade that he has in the New World with fur and also in India, he's able to pay for the building of Versailles. He's able to pay for his initial conquests abroad through mercantilism. But eventually, it's just not enough. Costs are adding up. And more issues arise. France still has competing religious factions within its country. Calvinists have been here for quite a while now. That's just an accepted reality in French culture. The Huguenots aren't going anywhere. While Louis did not like this, he accepted it. That is until another religious controversy breaks out in Europe. breaks out in France, and we call it the Jansenist movement. It is actually a division within the Catholic Church itself. It is a movement of Catholics who spoke out against the Jesuits and the Council of Trent, saying that they perverted the religion and that they must go back to a pre-Council of Trent world, pre-Jesuit world. So now even the Catholics within France are divided, and at this point Louis is just beside himself in frustration. So he attempts to deal with the entire situation by repealing his own grandfather's clause, the Edict of Nantes, saying that religious toleration is gone in France. Not only is it gone, but you must conform to the accepted beliefs of Catholicism, not this Jansenist movement. If you refuse to do so, you must leave, or I will make you. And since all things revolve around the Sun King, the problem is resolved. But we already start to see that his desire for control over everything is going to really dominate all of Louis's life. Religious conflict isn't the only conflict that Louis is going to deal with. He's going to continually involve France in a series of foreign conflicts with powers across Europe. He is going to start a war with Spain. He's going to start a war with the Dutch. He's going to be involved in the Holy Roman Empire and various territories there, and all of this is just extraordinarily expensive. He's trying to expand French control, Bourbon control in Europe, and while he technically doesn't lose, these wars aren't cheap, and he isn't really getting a lot out of it. This is a problem. He gained some territories in the Netherlands for the French, a few cities, but it's not really anything to write home about. This is not great. These problems continue to the point where all of Europe is starting to become extraordinarily alarmed with how much Louis is willing to fight. So in the late 17th century, we see Louis effectively going to war with almost every other major power in Europe. The Austrians, the Spanish, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, England, a bunch of other smaller states that have been up to this point rather inconsequential, all going to jump in and attempt to stop the aggression of Louis XIV. And they kind of do. The Treaty of Ryswick will actually give Louis a small set of victories, but it's effectively a draw. They can't beat him despite the combined effort of all these European powers, and that's the problem. Europe has become so dominated by a single nation that the balance of power is broken. And with Louis suffering from a case of the yum-nums, it's not going to end. One final conflict will be the coup de grace, the final piece that tips the scale even worse. Spain will have a monarch that doesn't have a child. Charles II of Spain, who's actually the brother-in-law of Louis, due to, again, the European inbreeding when it comes to royal families, is going to offer Louis's grandson, the second in line to become the King of France, he's going to offer him Spain. And Europe is terrified at this notion, because now the Bourbons would control not only France, but Spain. If you're the Habsburgs, you're like, what the hell, dude? What? What are you doing? You're giving away half of our kingdom to our biggest rival. If you're the British, you're terrified that your biggest rival, the French, are going to get larger. Everyone's freaking out. So again, a great alliance of European nations will step in to stop Louis from consolidating control of all of Western Europe under Bourbon control. And the Treaty of Utrecht will do that. Philip of Anjou will be allowed to become the King of Spain, but he will never be able to unite the two thrones together. So it's kind of a victory, again, for Louis in that, again, his son becomes king the way it was supposed to be. But the European powers can rest a little bit easier at night, knowing that they have some kind of formal agreement that France and Spain will never unite. But moral of the story is here that these wars are extraordinarily expensive. The cost has become so overwhelming that they can't even pay for them with their colonial exploits anymore. Mercantilism is falling short. And Louis is going to attempt to deal with this, or at least his son is going to attempt to deal with this through a series of shady deals that will blow up in their face, dealing with this Mississippi Company, Louisiana Territory. It gets a little complicated, but what it comes down to is a series of bad financial deals will really cripple the French government. And we are just moving towards a bad period in French history. The legacy of Louis XIV, of the Sun King, the greatest example of absolute monarchy in European history, is going to be tainted by ridiculous financial issues. He just overspent what France could bear. But during his reign, the French army is unrivaled. They are the great conserver of the arts, of music. Versailles is a great example of French dominance. All of these things are great, but money will drag it all down. The amount of debt incurred during Louis XIV's reign will never be solved by his son, Louis XV. And it will get Louis XVI a revolution. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.